Hello, everyone. Welcome to the LSU Press Remote Author Series. I am Liz Skilton, and I'm the author invited to be part of the series today. So I am, I think, live, and I'm watching it kind of pop on, so I can see a couple people starting to log on. So welcome, everyone. Okay, so I can see a couple more coming on. That's great. So as I stated right at the introduction, I'm Liz Skilton. I'm the author for the LSU Press Remote Author Series today, and I'm going to be talking about my book, Tempest, Hurricane Naming and American Culture, which came out last year and is for sale with LSU Press. And I believe that they're going to post some information about that in the comment feed a little bit below. So you can look for it there. I'm so excited to be part of this series today and to join you on Facebook Live. I've never done Facebook Live, so this is very cool. But like everyone else, I've had to adjust to this COVID world where we are all streaming from home. So it's great to join you. I hope that this will be a fun and interesting half-hour series. So I'd like to thank LSU Press for inviting me to join you today, particularly LB Kovac, who set things up for me, and James Wilson, who initiated contact along with Elisa Plant. I'd also like to thank my series editor, Margaret Lovecraft, and Craig Colton, who produced the Natural World of the Gulf South series, which Tempest is a part of. And if you haven't looked at the other books in the Natural World of the Gulf South series, I highly recommend you do so because they are fantastic and award-winning. So hi, Chris Maines, it's good to see you. Thanks for coming. So LSU Press says that the way that this usually works is that the author does a brief introduction for the book itself and then does some selected readings related to the content of the book. So readings from the actual book, which I've never done before, which will be really cool to do from Facebook. So my book, Tempest, Hurricane Naming and American Culture, published last year, emerged from a central question, which I know many of you probably have asked at some point in time, which is why do we name hurricanes? So hurricane season started yesterday. We already have a storm in the Gulf, tropical storm Cristobal, which I just got the notification on my phone about a half an hour ago, saying that it's the third named storm and the earliest in a season since about 2016. So we're breaking new records here in the start of the Atlantic hurricane season with Cristobal. But as with every hurricane season, we ask these questions over why do we name storms, and then we move on to actually tracking and talking about the storms themselves. I'm sure a lot of you can probably think about why we name storms, or you might have heard some stories about where these storm names came from at different points in time. But you know, we don't usually dwell on it besides just at this very beginning, and then sometimes throughout the course of a season as we're kind of reflecting as to why the name Cristobal was used with the latest storm, for instance. I wanted to unpack that and from the perspective of history, take a look at what these storm names really do to our perception of storms, how they influence how we think about storms, and then particularly how we remember storms. So, you know, how we talk about storms to come as well as storms in the past. And by delving into this history of why we name storms, I discovered a much larger story about the history of meteorology, the intersections of environment and culture, and then obviously gendered, because as you probably know, our storm naming system is based on a gendered naming system, in that we have male and female named storms in the mix that we use each year for various lists that are now globally used. And these lists become part of our lives as these storms become part of our lives, and thus the names become part of our lives as well. So that's what the book was supposed to be about. That's where it went. And I'm really excited to share some segments with you today. I'm going to be reading the start of the first chapter in the book, Tempest. And the chapter is titled Maria and the Birth of Modern Meteorology, which if you read it initially, you think Maria. It actually is pronounced Mariah, which we find out through the course of the chapter. So we can get it confused with Hurricane Maria of 2017, but this is referring to Mariah. And you'll get that in a little bit. So I can see some emotions coming forward here. All right, so let's begin. In 1938, a bespectacled 40-something English professor in Northern California started devoting uncommon attention to the weather. George R. Stewart, a scholar of English literature at the University of California, Berkeley, was always interested in the history of the natural world, but recently more so because of his experience with a barrage of odd weather while living in California. For the next 3 years, he spent time poring over news coverage of deadly winter storms, researching emerging weather tracking technologies, and plumbing classical literature for references to violent tempests. He even shadowed employees of a newly formed federal agency, the Weather Bureau, to learn their advanced tracking tactics. Finally, his research and his imagination coalesced into a story of a massive fictional hurricane that swept from California to New York sometime in the mid-century. In November 1941, he published a 349-page disaster novel titled Storm. Each of the novel's 12 chapters traced a single day in the hurricane's life and the valiant efforts of a young meteorologist to track its progress. Stewart was so confident of the book's success, so sure of the public's hunger for a story about a cataclysmic natural disaster and the human efforts to understand it, that before the book's release, he lined up speaking engagements on both coasts and planned his victory tour. And he was right. Not even the shock of Pearl Harbor, which hurled the United States into a world war just 2 weeks after the novel's release, would quench demand for it. Even as the American public prepared for the largest mobilization effort in history, their fascination with Stewart's fictional hurricane deepened, and sales outpaced Stewart's wildest dreams. Stewart's confidence of the success of his hurricane novel was well-founded, as the field of disaster fiction gained popularity throughout the 1930s. In most disaster novels, the plot centered on the course and effects of a disaster at a specific site and featured a few key heroes who dealt bravely with disasters and their aftermath. John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, published in 1935, followed a family of tenant farmers through the Dust Bowl, examining the depth of Depression-era despair. Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, published in 1937, reviewed the decimation of levees in Lake Okeechobee, Florida, during the 1928 hurricane as an allegory for the Jim Crow South. And in 1941, 9 months before Stewart's Storm was released, William Alexander Percy offered a poignant memory of disaster relief during the great 1927 Mississippi River flood in Lanterns on the Levee. Each of these novels focused on cataclysmic natural events. What set Storm apart was that the disaster it centered on, a hurricane, was wholly imaginary. Stewart knew that his novel's focus on a disaster, real or fictional, was enough to catapult it to the bestseller lists. It capitalized on or exploited one of America's greatest fears, uncontrollable weather. Although this fear was as old as America itself, it peaked in the mid-20th century as technological advancements made the prospect of controlling the weather vaguely possible. With disastrous plagues, floods, storms, and fires in Americans' recent memory, it was easy to visualize the imagined disaster. So it was that when Storm was published, the American imagination was ripe for a story about the human effort to tame a wild storm using the latest in meteorological knowledge and weather tracking technology. Stewart's novel was up to the task. Storm eventually affected the progression of war, the field of meteorology, the cultural impressions of wind, and pioneered a new genre of ecological fiction. It did all of this because the storm, the main character, was assigned a name, Mariah. Following the introduction of this mythical and created fictional hurricane Mariah, Stewart's book Storm became a popular bestseller during World War II, inspiring the introduction of a codenaming system used for storms in the Pacific Theater while at war that mimicked the naming system introduced using storms like Mariah as a way to name tropical storms. And thus inspires the introduction of an official naming system in the 1950s that uses female named storms that we continue to use in an adapted form today. So George R. Stewart, in creating this story and drawing from this history of meteorology and this current trend in meteorological development right at the start of World War II, really becomes this catalyst for the adoption of the hurricane naming system that we know and use so well today. If I were to ask you about your best known storms, so the ones that you remember, you would probably tell me storms from the most recent past as well as storms from a further past. I imagine that many of these names would probably be female names because since 1954 through the 1970s, storms were named exclusively after females, using women's names entirely. During the 1970s, feminists who were drawing attention to larger issues related to sexism in American society protested these names, thus causing the change in the naming system to now include the current system we use today with equal gendered names, alternating between male and female names, beginning in 1978 and through the 1979 season. So past 1979, male named storms become part of this mix. And the adoption of these new male names in this naming system was a really interesting shift as well. So much like the adoption of female named storms and kind of thinking about a storm as a particular gendered object. I'm going to read from chapter 4, which talks about this shift to these male named storms and how we tried to reimagine what a hurricane could look like, not only as a feminine object, but as a masculine object. The chapter is called Andrew and the Business of Storms. The 1992 hurricane season was off to a slow start. By early August, not a single hurricane had formed in the Atlantic region, a rarity for an area with devastating activity in the years prior. But just as the country relaxed, an alien emerged on the horizon as rapidly as the ever-feared UFO. The beast we named Andrew, reported the Miami Herald, howled ashore near Florida Keys as a Category 5 storm headed straight for Homestead, Florida. As coverage of the storm shifted to the known Florida locales and identified Andrew as the worst of its kind, television meteorologists and reporters geared up for the first ever 24-hour live coverage of a hurricane. Leading the charge was a new type of television meteorologist, Brian Norcross, who sat at the helm of Miami's WTVJ News Channel 4 for 23 hours during landfall, reassuring residents and reporting details to all tuning in to a live broadcast. And watching they were. In the 1980s and 1990s, Americans were obsessed with the weather again, consuming it in new forms in local and national spaces, and participating by sharing personal footage caught with portable video cameras. Part of this obsession stemmed from the coverage's new form, live continuous reporting, which provided growing detail of the storm's movements and impact, complete with sound and image. Through this, hurricanes were grittier, more dramatic, and sensationalized than ever before. These excessively graphic hurricanes were directly supported by a new scientific classification for wind speeds, such as the Saffir-Simpson Hurricane Wind Scale, which delineated categories of intensity, helping to rank storms as larger and deadlier than their predecessors. The increased coverage and newly categorized deadly storms reinvigorated descriptive creativity of storms movements at the same time that Americans culturally redefined the hurricane due to a change in the official naming process. As male-female naming storm list debuted in the 1980s, becoming part of cultural tradition by the 1990s, hurricanes again became the site of cultural discourse on gender. As a result, hurricanes yet again became the gender-specific assassins of our nightmares, a place to work out our cultural fears and a reflector of larger debates about gender at the close of the century. Featured in this discourse was an attempt to redefine an object long described as a feminine entity. Americans wrestled with the new possibilities provided with male-named storms, finally settling on the pattern of hurricane gendering established during the storms of the 1950s and 1960s. Hurricanes were described with the worst possible gendered adjectives of the time period, fitting with the gendered nomenclature that was attached. These adjectives emerged against the backdrop of the close of the Vietnam and Cold Wars, reckoning with environmental changes wrought by human development, debates over new status for women post-feminist movement, new forms of sexual expression and gender definition post-sexual revolution and post-gay liberation movement, and the rise of a new era of conservative politics and pundits focused on family values, morality, and foreign aggressors wielding drugs, war, or threatening American might. Thus, in this context, male hurricanes were aliens from the sky, militarized weapons of war, and unstoppable natural enemies of the state. Not only did this new breed of male hurricanes fascinate Americans, but so did their aftermath. The growth of discourse through 24-hour news coverage meant the growth of the business of storms, and with it, larger consumption of all aspects of the coverage. Storm coverage was now laid out in granular detail through 24-hour news channels looking for new angles, stories, and details to garner continued interest in their coverage. Increasingly, 24-hour news focused on the storm's aftermath as detailed coverage of bungled evacuation efforts, stalled relief, and mismanagement or lack of relief support served as a way to extend coverage of a storm. As millions of Americans watched Andrew and other hurricanes in the 1980s and 1990s and reacted to their detailed coverage, a new consciousness emerged regarding response. Soon after Andrew, calls for change in federal, state, and local disaster relief policy due to outcry over incidents of mismanagement increased. This spreading sense of responsibility for disaster management extended the definitions of not only hurricanes and their aftermath, but also other hazards, forever changing the understanding of what constitutes a disaster. Most of all, though, this redefinition of disaster occurred as Americans renegotiated the gender descriptions of hurricanes, providing an opportunity to yet again connect hurricane naming to other changes in American society. Today, hurricane names still cause us to think about their impact and effect. The descriptors we use to describe them are both funny and humorous at certain moments and dramatic and revealing at others. But more importantly, they show us how the descriptions we use to describe disasters influence how we think about these disasters. Tempest ends by talking about what this story of hurricane naming can tell us about how we talk about disasters. Everything from floods, for instance, like the 2016 floods, to hurricanes like Harvey and Maria in 2017, to even most recent incidents as to disasters that are ongoing even today. So what we decide to call a pandemic, for instance. Overall, the storm naming story that starts with this question of why we name hurricanes and isn't that interesting turns into a much larger story about how do we talk about disaster and what does it mean to describe a disaster one way? How does it influence how we think about disaster overall? That concludes the reading portion of the remote author series, and it looks like I've got some time for questions. Does anybody have anything they would like me to talk about in particular or want to know more about in reference to Tempest? So I know I went pretty quickly. So, and I'm also happy to talk about the current storm system. So we got an interesting list of names for 2020 and anticipated a heavy season, so an active season in particular. And I know that we're definitely watching the Gulf right now to see what's happening in the next couple of weeks here. Let me see if I can come here. So Christine Skilton, that's my mom, so thanks mom, says, what is your next book? Which I know that she's very curious to know about. I'm currently working on an edited collection with others on the history of American disasters. And so that will be through LSU Press, and it's in works, and we've got a bunch of different scholars that are participating in it that are disaster scholars. So we'll be posting some more information on that a little bit later. And then I think my next book is going to be looking at Louisiana disasters in particular, particularly disasters since Hurricane Katrina, so recent Louisiana disasters. So I'm excited about it. So, and then LSU Press had a question that do you have a favorite hurricane name from the upcoming season? So if you can post in the comment section, you can maybe talk about that. And anybody have a favorite hurricane name from the upcoming season? And then Christopher Maines wants to know what my interest is in hurricanes. I stumbled into studying hurricanes when I attended Tulane University for my graduate degree and was really interested in environmental history. And being at Tulane in New Orleans, you cannot talk about environmental history without talking about hurricanes. And thus my interest in hurricanes started there and then progressed into this discussion of, well, why do we name storms to begin with? Because you see these names and they definitely play a role in how we talk about these various storms that particularly New Orleanians, Louisianans, and Gulf South residents deal with. So I can see Laura Gleason has a question that says, what is the requirement for retiring a hurricane name? So much like retiring a jersey, a name is retired based on a specific amount of damage that comes with a particular storm. So if a storm is significant in American culture or otherwise globally and causes a significant amount of damage met at a threshold set by the World Meteorological Organization and others, that name will be retired. So there is a list of retired names that you can find if you just search for it for Wikipedia. It'll pop right up, but it'll include the names that you would probably expect that would be on the list. So you'll never see, for instance, another Hurricane Katrina. You will never see another Hurricane Betsy because these are names that have meaning. They have reached that threshold of significance and they have been retired. Other names are reused, and often you will find them frequently reused depending on the level of severity. And so you might see a name from, say, a list that occurred in the 1960s used in the list for the 2010s, for instance, or in even the 2020s coming up. So a tropical storm that kind of peters out in the Gulf, that's a good example of a storm name that might be used yet again. So let's see if there's anything else. So I enjoyed watching from Tucson. Thank you. So not many hurricanes for Tucson, but you have other major disasters that you face in that area. So some that you name in various ways. But only hurricanes will be named after male and female names. The Weather Channel has its own naming system that they use for winter storms that's not officially recognized by the National Weather Service. So that's a separate system that's developed. But if we look at the origins of the hurricane naming system, we can kind of see where it comes from if we're talking about George R. Stewart. Laura wants to know, what do you think about the name Dolly? You know, when we look at the original naming conventions, so how they came up with the names and the process of naming storms, they were originally supposed to be very short names, storms that you would be able to easily pronounce and that would be commonly recognized and not easy to misspell. And that would be memorable along this alphabetical naming system. So Dolly definitely fits within that, that categorization of it. But I mean, you could also say that when I see Dolly, it reminds me of the sheep, right? But that's another example of it. So yes, you will see names. I see your comment just below that they might be your own name on the list, and you can actually submit names to be added to the list. So they're reviewed and often chosen 6 to 10 years out, but they're reviewed every single year to make sure that no names are culturally or politically significant. So if, for instance, if we had a name of a current president or a senator or maybe even a cultural figure that is really well known, that their name accidentally was on the list, that would be removed and another one would be swapped out for it. So there are certain standards and processes developed to make sure that that doesn't happen. So you're never going to see a Hurricane Adolf is like the common example that's used in the hurricane history. So that's one that is excluded. So Dolly the musical, yeah, definitely. Awesome. These are great questions. I appreciate it. So, and I can see a lot of names from others that are joining. So thanks for coming, Ansley. Okay, well, I have about 2 minutes left. If anyone has any additional questions, feel free to ask them. If not, I want to take this time to again thank LSU Press for inviting me to be part of the Remote Author Series. So this was fun to do a reading of the book. And again, you can purchase the book through, I have to figure out which direction to turn here, through LSU Press, their website, and they've got a code for a discount right now, along with all of their other titles. So again, you can also check out the Natural World of the Gulf South series, which includes some award-winning books that talk about the Gulf South, environmental history, and how we think about it. In addition, all other LSU books are eligible for purchase as part of the discount code. So go shopping. So I know that I will after this because now is the time to read. All right, so final question. So Laura wants to know, is there any attempts to use more ethnic ethnically diverse names. Yes, there are regional committees that are established through the World Meteorological Organization that choose names for different regions of the world to be used for tropical storms, cyclones, and hurricanes. And these regions pitch their own names for these different lists that are supposed to be ethnically representative of the specific region in question. So for instance, for the Atlantic region that I am in with the Gulf South, so we also work with the Caribbean in pitching names along with Mexico and others within that region. So that's why you'll see some of these other types of names come into the mix, as well as some popular American names. But that's why you have all of these different names. In addition, the lists alternate to make sure that they're going male to female. And when we have storms that cross over between, say, the Pacific Theater or the Pacific Ocean region to the Atlantic Ocean region, you might see the attachment of a new name when it crosses in. So we've had a couple of examples of that in past hurricane history. So sometimes they stick the name in kind of a hyphen, and sometimes they move away and just call it something new. So pay attention. That's very rare that happens, but it's kind of cool when it does. So, all right. Thank you all for attending the Remote Author Series for LSU Press. I am Liz Skilton, and obviously I was talking about my book Tempest, and thank you for coming. Have a great day, everyone.